Hi, Joel Kreisberg here with my colleague Tim Owens. Hey, Tim.
Hi, Joel.
We're talking about our favorite subject, Journey of Inspiring Homeopathy. It's a class starting in January, and what we'd like to talk to a little bit today is kind of a piece that we're adding to it, which is a language and a way of understanding what is the difference between a universal perspective of a homeopathic materia medica or remedies versus a constitutional understanding of a homeopathic remedy versus, either as a gross use. And within this idea, one of the things that's coming up is the idea that how I approach, how I show up, my consciousness, the way that I practice thinking about remedies and looking at people and looking at my clients and actually what I do and how I practice affects the way I understand remedies and understand the interaction. Well, that's a big handful there. In order to talk about it, we're going to introduce this idea of, it's a system of talking about consciousness in terms of gross consciousness, subtle consciousness, and causal consciousness. And I'm using Ken Wilber's language, but Tim sometimes talks a little bit from his own TM background on this, and we'll bounce it back a little bit forth. But if I were thinking about gross consciousness, let's just start with that. I'm thinking about the physical waking state. It's like my sensory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the gross would be the things that we can agree collectively that we see or hear or observe in our environment. And so the term I was just talking about, it's intersubjective replicability. In other words, if for example, we're proving a remedy and somebody breaks out in a rash as a result of taking the remedy, we can say, oh, that remedy seems to be capable of causing a rash on the forearm. And everybody can see it. We all can look at it and say, look at that rash. He took this remedy, there's a rash. That's gross level measurement. And I would say a lot of homeopathy, a lot of our basic provings, particularly the older provings, were thoroughly engrossed in that level of perception. We perceive the gross level of things. It causes vomiting and nausea. It causes rashes. It gives a headache in the left parietal lobe, and so on and so forth. That's gross.
Well, no, it's really useful for you to point that out, because actually we spend a lot of time in the gross awareness and the gross consciousness. It's not just that's because materia medica, because that's what most of us are doing. Mm-hmm. Right? So we got to say that. And using that image, let's take the remedy rust tox. That rash, if it has the characteristics, that fit rust tox of, better continued motion and more liking heat and, worse overexertion, will be the use of the remedy rust tox in a gross way. And it's cool and it works.
And I like the use of a remedy like rus, because let's face it, if you meet somebody who's had at least 15 minutes exposure to homeopathy, he's probably heard of arnica and rus. So those are two of our greatest remedies, certainly great remedies for bringing people into the fold and getting them to understand, boys and girls, there's something going on here. These are not just sugar pills. So these two remedies have done great service for us. And almost everybody has had some kind of experience with rus. Now, that's the gross level of rus. But if a person becomes a homeopath, he has the opportunity to interact with a subtler dimension of rus toxicodendron.
The subtler dimensions. So let's start by talking about what is the subtler dimensions, because we're all, having subtle experiences actually as well. I mean, so you could start by saying subtle is the dream state. When I'm in a dream, it seems real. I'm closing my eyes.
And it's fluid and interconnected and unpredictable, and it has all sorts of elements that echo this idea of the imaginative function of human beings. So the gross physical sensory world has a certain A leads to B leads to C. In a dream, A leads to 27. How come? It's free.
it's not limited to the gross physical reality. It's in the imagination is the remedy that you
Yeah.
use. And so I think of the experiences that I have listening to music as being a very easy access to the subtle.
Yeah. And so when we approach a remedy from the subtle dimension, I would argue that brings in, perhaps James Tyler Kent was moving in that direction when he started to develop his repertory, and he began to place emphasis on the mental symptoms and began to say, gee, don't give this remedy unless these mental pictures are available. So he's starting to take us from the gross physical, from the world of just basic generalities, better, hot, and cold, and physical symptoms, and leading us deeper inward. And from that point, homeopathy has had this steady march more and more and more into the subtle dimensions. Certainly when you look at materia medica from people like Jan Schulten, from Shankaran,
Right.
You're seeing more and more of that subtle dimension being brought in. And then I would argue one of my favorites is Tina Smits. Tina's was clearly hardwired for appreciating these subtle dimensions, and that's why we do this stuff.
Interesting. And and then Bethulkis is put his name in there as the really emphasizing the subtle. And of course, the difference between gross and subtle you don't rule out the gross. I mean, within the subtle, you still can have the physical states. I mean, even the etheric notion of there's life force in the animated body is a very subtle sort of perspective. And so we could say that constitutional prescribing, it's not ruling out the gross state because it can be gross, but its emphasis is on the subtle.
I would agree.
Yeah. And it's a brilliant distinction compared to conventional biomedicine.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a third one. And so then comes Tinus, you mentioned Tinus. And so in Inspiring Homeopathy, there's this language of universal. Mm-hmm. And so we're toying with this idea of perhaps, is that what we came up with? The causal is what distinguishes. So let's talk about what causal is. So causal is distinguished from subtle is more of, well, let's start with, you go to dream sleep, then there's deep sleep. There's no dreams, there's just, I'm alive and I'm not really aware of anything. I'm still here, but I'm like missing it all because I'm in deep sleep, but my brain is doing something. Okay, and so in the causal, which is you can actually access if you meditate, from what I understand, quite a bit, is you might say that it's where sort of certain deep levels of archetypal nature exists in some way. It's like, what is time?
It's the ground state of the subtle. The subtle, in my opinion, arises from that causal level.
The subtle arrives out of the causal.
Mm-hmm.
And so then from this idea of causal, we'll say archetypal, just to use that, not in the sort of, superficial notion of archetypes, but just a deep forces that bring us here. Is that where the universal, or let's say, what is a universal remedy? Or how is Rustox now moving from subtle to universal? What distinguishes it?
Yeah, and again, the word I like to use here is suggestive. It's highly suggestive. But for those of us who have used Smits's work, we are certainly aware of the gross state. Most of us started with a remedy like Rustox, which he calls a universal remedy. We're very familiar with using it for sprained ankles and skin rashes and things like that. And over time, most of us have had the experience of having a case that expressed some gross symptoms, but also some deeper things that suggested Rustox. For example, almost as if the general moved into the subtle mental, and you see somebody who's better with motion or mental activity and worse on the first motion, but better continued motion. So you start to use Rus in a subtler fashion. You start to bring in the mental picture of Rus. But then Tina Smits comes along and he says, well, boys and girls, we need to stop for a moment and really think about this remedy. And I would argue even feel the remedy and feel what this plant carries in its nature at its very deepest level. And I think when he accessed the idea, the pure archetypal idea of ruse, he tapped into that causal layer and said, this is universal. This experience of suffering is universal to the human experience, and ruse captures it. And so when we see somebody who comes in and says, I have suffered a severe trauma, they start to speak from the causal level. It is then essential that a homeopath, that whoever is listening to this story, be able to appreciate what trauma and what this deep suffering, what it springs from, where it comes from, and what it resonates with. In that sense, Joel, it is critical that the homeopath be capable of accessing causal level material. And that's not going to happen if the homeopath hasn't done his or her homework.
So I appreciate that. So that's a perfect description of it. So we're saying that there's the gross understanding or gross way of using rust tox. There's a subtle way of using rust tox. We'll call that constitutional. And we're suggesting that there's a universal understanding of rust tox. That's Smith's way of using it. And actually, what came to mind is Goethe's idea of the plant, the archetypal sort of nature, his whole metamorphosis of plants, the plant. So there's an rust tox, there's an archetypal way of it. And what you then said is, but it's not that I learn it, it's that I somehow embody the understanding through my own development. And so this is why we keep talking about the journey of inspiring homeopathy as the development, is practitioner development. It's I do my work, which is state consciousness. So I understand remedies. I don't just study a remedy. I actually have to be in a group that's working toward understanding the universal archetypes of these remedies. That's what a study group is. The journey that we do, which is 18 weeks long, is a group of 12 all working together to access this causal understanding. And the way that I access it is through doing my own meditative work with the remedy. That could be taking it, it could be holding it, but to also be in a group so that it's not linear knowledge, causal. It's this interesting way that causal knowledge sort of comes in and out when we set our intentions and we keep visiting it. And it sort of shows, how would you describe that part of the process?
Well, I'm listening to you, and all I can think to myself is, look, this is just stuff you can't get from a book. There's no way you can read this, and I'll borrow from Robert Heinlein, you can't grok it. In order to deeply understand these remedies, we need to go to a whole different way of learning. In fact, I would use the word discovering. Because truly what you're doing with an archetypal remedy, with one of these deep, deep remedies, is you are uncovering its archetypal nature. And that requires something completely different from sitting with a book or talking about it in a lecture or even a discussion with a group of good homeopaths. It is a terribly subjective experience that requires us to go in. We have to go inside because that's where this material resides. It's not out there, it's in here.
And it's a journey. So what you're describing, it's a journey. And when you say it's in here, it's not in here in me, it's in here that I access, and I want to hear the others' access to it. So I get the different fractal images of the universal. Because I may see snippets of it, but when I listen to your snippet of it, it sort of starts to piece together what that's like, and I take it in as it emerges.
Yeah. So
versus just go sit and read.
As you know, I've been teaching my entire life. I was a high school English teacher. I was a teacher of transcendental meditation. I've been teaching forever. When I went to France in 2007 and participated in this group with Tina Smits, it was an incredible exposure to how this process works. It was the weirdest thing to just sit with a group of people and have somebody hand you a remedy, and everybody would interact with the remedy, and then they would close their eyes and meditate, and then this incredible material would come out. It was the first time I'd ever seen something like this, or I should more accurately say, it was the first time I ever felt something like this. It's the reason that I'm still doing it. I want other people to have that experience. I want them to realize there are incredible ways to learn or discover these magical remedies that we work with. And I would think any homeopath would be anxious once he or she realizes, oh yeah, there's a gross, subtle, and causal level. I want access to all three. I don't want just one or two. I want all of them.
Yeah.
If we're going to be healers, that's what we need.
Yes, and of course, and what you just pointed out, when I can access all of them, it's amazing how much the causal use, the universal use of remedies, it becomes, you prescribe intuitively, because that's what that causal understanding is. So it becomes less work in a certain way, because the work you did before you got to see the client. You do the work on your cushion or in your study or in your way of learning and deepening our own understanding of the subtle and the causal, and that's the daily work of mindfulness.
Yeah.
So we're gonna cut this, but we love teaching this class. It looks like we're just doing it once a year at this particular stage. The next one will be in January of 2018. And if this is something that appeals to you, you can learn more about it. And I thank you, Tim, for taking the time to chat with me.
My pleasure as always, Joel.